the right and the left are getting more and more polarized. Everyone has seen this. For example, Peter and I generally vote Republican. I don't think that would be accurate to describe our view.
Correct.
Peter and I, we've kind of synthesized what our top three concerns are politically and socially. And so our hope here is that we can talk to someone who I respect very much, Michael is in that category, that has a different perspective. Welcome back to the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. I'm JP and I got my brother.
Peter, right here.
We're so glad that you joined us. We have a very special guest, Michael Bruner, also Dr. Michael Bruner, but we're going to refer to him as Michael because I know that he might get a little queasy if we just say doctor too much. So Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're most welcome. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Absolutely. It is our great pleasure to have you here. If you don't know already, you're about to know soon. Peter and I are Catholic artists working to revitalize the world of Catholic art through our films about faith, not necessarily faith films. If you know that that's our mission, you know that that's a little bit about our bias, where our perspectives come from are very much a Catholic perspective that's ingrained with a deep appreciation for history and Catholic art specifically through history. Given that we take our Catholic faith very seriously, I definitely categorize myself as right of center. I used to think of myself as far right, but I don't really think that anymore now that I have a better vision of what that really means. Although some things, when you hear my perspective, it's going to be pretty far right. And not all my perspectives are that way. And then Peter, I think you would probably classify yourself kind of similar, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things where you're a bit of both. You know, some certain ideas might be perceived as kind of more right, and then some kind of more to the center or to the left.
Yeah.
So there's no like cookie cutter kind of image for everyone. You know, everyone's different.
Well, the reason why we bring this up is because we're seeing in this day and age that the right and the left are getting more and more polarized. Everyone has seen this. We comment upon it. We say how terrible it is, how frightening it is, how people are becoming more violent about it. And so our hope here is that we can talk to someone who I respect very much, Michael is in that category, that has a different perspective. I think that Michael, you probably wouldn't call yourself so much a center left, but I think that you, for example, Peter and I generally vote Republican. I don't think you would call yourself, I don't think that would be accurate to describe our view.
Correct.
Great. Okay. This is helpful then. I think our different perspectives will really lend hopefully to our conversation here. And just so people know a little bit about Michael, I'll say a little bit of his bio here. So he attended Princeton Seminary and received a Master's of Divinity degree. Michael has been ordained into the Presbyterian Church. He moved to Malibu, California in 2000, working in internet startups and advertising. He pivoted back to academia and taught for 17 years in departments of English and theology at Azusa Pacific University, and eventually graduated with a PhD in theology and culture from Fuller Seminary, which is when I met you, Michael. You were studying at Fuller Seminary. Mm-hmm. So we definitely have a big time guest here, a big time brain powered guest that can really, I think, help us see some of our blind spots. What we're going to do here is talk about what Peter and I, we've kind of synthesized what our top three concerns are politically and socially, and say why are we concerned about them, and then how we can fix it. And our hope is afterwards, as you know, Michael, you're going through and you're telling us maybe how we've missed what our blind spots are and how we're not correct. We can hear what your top three concerns are politically, socially, economically, whatever it is in that sphere, and then how you would propose we try and fix that. If that works for everyone, I think we jump right in.
Yeah, works for me. I get to point out all the mistakes you make, and you don't get to point out any of mine. So it's really lovely. I like this. I like this a lot. No, I'm kidding. Feel free to correct me where you think obviously I'm misguided. So
right.
Yeah,
well, I think we'll be asking questions. I know I'll be asking questions, and that's kind of I think how we can try and understand better. But real quickly, go ahead, Peter. Sorry.
I really appreciate that, Michael, that you're willing to like kind of speak with us and kind of delve into these different ideas, because I mean, that's what I feel like is missing so much today. Like this the ability to have a conversation and share differing ideas and like be able to critique what you think is wrong or where someone's like, you know, misguided, but also not seeing them for their intentions. And like, I know that we're all trying to do what's good. We're trying to do something right. And not kind of like demonizing each other for that.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, Peter. And I do think what you guys are doing with this podcast is exactly what this culture needs at this point. It's what the church needs. It's what the culture needs. And unfortunately, too many elected officials on both sides no longer know the art of disputation. They don't understand it. They're just yelling at each other. And too many of the issues we find ourselves embroiled in are just people yelling at each other, and there's no one interested in actually listening. And that's a discipline, and it takes a lot of work. So the fact that you guys are setting up this sort of venue where people can exchange ideas without having to insult each other. It's as old as the hills, but it's so incredibly contemporary and so lovely that you guys, I hope may 1 million followers descend upon your podcast in the next few months and weeks and days.
Hopefully you don't rescind that beautiful wish upon us afterwards, because you'll have to give us a grade on our listening skills. Hopefully we're good listeners. Thank you.
No, it's gonna be great. I look forward to it. I'm sorry, I keep moving around trying to improve the light. I suck at technology, as you're gonna find out. And may I just add, James, that it was James who helped me put this podcast up and website on. And without your help, James, I would have been hopelessly lost. And as you can tell, as I'm fumbling around on my computer and giving people vertigo by even just tuning in, I need a lot of help in that area. So I'm sorry for that ahead of time.
Thank you for being here, Michael. We appreciate you, and I'm sure our audience will as well. Before we kind of start talking, could you fill out a little bit more about how you would you say you're more of a centrist, correct? Do you mind kind of expanding a little bit of how you might describe yourself? Yeah.
So that's a many layered question and
Sure.
Deserves a more thoughtful answer than the one I'm about to give, right? This would be it's what I call a 2-beer question. We'd have to sit down for a couple of beers and talk about that for a while. But the sort of the kind of the messy short answer is I have come to this place. I wasn't always necessarily here where I would describe myself. And as you both well know, the terms we use are so unhelpful. So as soon as you guys say you normally vote Republican or you're right of center, my initial reaction to that is just to completely dismiss all of that. Because in many ways, it does more harm than good. Because the truth is so much more subtle and supple than that. Now, obviously, having just said that, I recognize that there are a lot of trolls on both sides of the political aisle who have no room or time for subtlety. They want something that fits on a bumper sticker. They want to be reelected, and off we go, right? And that's why here we are. We find ourselves in a situation like this. So, but understanding that labels can be marginally helpful. Yes, I am a centrist, in the sense that I don't ascribe to either the Republican or Democratic platform in toto. And quite frankly, I don't see how anyone can who's a follower of Jesus Christ. So that's just there's the first little TNT bomb I'll just drop on the floor. I'll give you one little anecdote that may help kind of explain where I come from. So I was raised in the Philippines, missionary parents, born and raised there, grew up speaking Tagalog English. We lived out in the boonies, which is actually a Tagalog word, bundok, which means mountains. And it came out of World War II. So we literally lived in the boonies, way out in near where the film Apocalypse Now was filmed. Francis Ford Coppola's
of course,
iconic
classic.
Film. Yeah, classic film. And so it was right nearby. In fact, they moved in for filming the year after we moved away, moved to the States. And I grew up in a home that was politically liberal, progressive, but theologically conservative, which immediately in this day and age seems like a contradiction in terms. But of course, my family likes to joke, that's exactly what Jesus was, so we feel like we're in good company. And I say that partly in jest. But so I grew up in a home that was, in fact, I'm in my parents' home as I speak, because we're on vacation. My family and I were on our way to the UK tomorrow or Monday for 3 weeks. Looking forward to that. But I'm in my home. My parents are both still living and healthy, and I'm grateful to them for all that they've taught me and my brother. I have one older brother. And I've always found that mix of theologically conservative and politically progressive, though it may on the surface seem very contradictory, I actually think, and maybe that will come out in the process of this conversation, really actually complement each other in some pretty profound ways. So the anecdote is this. I was at Princeton Seminary. I had come from the University of Washington, where I got my bachelor's degree in English. And I was a pastor at a church, a small Presbyterian church there, that would be loosely considered, well, back in the day, evangelical. Now that's just a totally loaded term that I try to avoid. But it was orthodox. It was whatever, traditional, I guess, conservative. And my main recommendation to Princeton Seminary was my mentor at the University of Washington, my favorite professor, maybe of all time, maybe with one or two exceptions, but Willis Koenig, one of the icons of the University of Washington in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he was a gay Russian Jew. So we used to joke that he was 3 times a minority. He would joke about it, that he was gay, he was Russian at the time. This was before the end of the Cold War in '89, and he was Jewish. But an absolutely lovely, lovely human being who I grew to just love very much. And we had a very, very close relationship. And just, he was a huge influence on me. So he writes my main recommendation to Princeton Seminary. So I go to Princeton Seminary, and I had no qualms. That he was gay. Of course, it wasn't the heightened politicized issue it is now. And so here I go, right? I'm off. I'm this theologically conservative. He knew that he and I maybe didn't necessarily agree on whatever certain issues, but it wasn't a hot topic of conversation. Obviously didn't get in the way of our relationship. So I show up at Princeton Seminary, and I find that when I showed up there in 1991, I think it was 91, the more liberal faction on campus had really kind of taken over the conversation. And at that point, it was the gay and lesbian issue. The moniker LGBTQIA, so on and so forth, was not even part of the common lingo. So it was the gay and lesbian issue. And of course, it was a hot topic back then. It has been in the Presbyterian Church since the mid to late 80s. So I was coming into this, and I noticed that, and I had long hair. I didn't listen to Christian music. I loved Neil Young. I looked like a hippie right out of Seattle, total tree-hugging dude. I wore the uniform, the Birkenstocks and the Paisley and all of that. And I think I even had an earring in my ear at that point. So I was dyed-in-the-wool, 100% Greenpeace sticker-wearing dude. But I was theologically conservative. So immediately, my effect is that I make everyone angry. Because politically, I make people who are conservative angry, and theologically, I make people who are liberal angry. And I noticed that all of my friends who were more evangelical were basically shut down. If they disagreed with the gay and lesbian platform in any way, they were considered bigots, they were intolerant, they were terrible people. And so no one was saying much of anything there about it. And because I grew up in the Philippines, I was a white kid among a lot of brown skin. I didn't fit in. I've never fit in. Well, that just made me angry. I thought, well, that's not right. People need to speak up. So I became, the unwitting spokesperson for a more conservative take on the gay and lesbian issue, which it was not what I wanted. No, thank you. I don't want to be labeled a bigot and prejudiced and closed-minded and all of this. I was just loath to be that. But I also was like, I'm not going to let one side of the political persuasion completely drown out the other side for fear of we wouldn't have called it then canceling, but that's exactly what was happening. Yeah. And I just didn't like it. So my schismatic quirk all popped up, and I was like, oh no, we're gonna make a real debate out of this. So I helped write what's called the Princeton Declaration, and it was very controversial on campus. It made it to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church. It got disseminated, I think all around the world, quite literally. And it was a position that I thought was quite measured and thoughtful, but it just expressed a more conservative view on that issue. But one of our central tenets was compassion is essential. You can't demonize someone if you don't happen to agree with them. That's a terrible thing to do. So that's one example of where I found my voice because I didn't like the dynamic, and I was kind of pissed off. I was like, well, this isn't right. I mean, and had I come in and I think if I had sensed that my liberal friends were being drowned out by conservatives, I would have found some reason to protest there, and I would have come up with a different declaration, So that's, so I've tried to find myself in some ways by always siding with the outcast. Like, who's being drowned out of the conversation? Who's being told to shut up because, their view is either politically incorrect or it's not savory to some political types? I have no room for that. So anyway.
When you describe yourself, you make me think of how one of my favorite authors, G.K. Chesterton, describes himself, how yes. he found that there was nothing to revolt or rebel against, so he rebelled back to orthodoxy.
Yes, exactly. And G.K. Chesterton is my favorite writer.
I love that guy. He's awesome.
Yeah, he's so lovely. I totally agree. There was, so he, exactly, right? He staked his claim on this thing he had discovered only to find out the church was there 2,000 years before.
Whoops. Yes. Anyway, okay. Thank you for the generous description. I think that really helps our audience as we go through this. They'll understand, hopefully, what we're going for, which is we have people of different perspectives trying to solve problems together and then understand why someone on the other side of a debate or an issue might think the way that they do. Or maybe we all agree on everything that we're going to talk about. We'll find out. We haven't planned this. Yeah. So I think Peter and I will jump in here. Our first real concern, and I think Peter and I come to this concern from different sides, given that Peter is a single young man. I'm a decade his senior, but I'm also, I have a family and we have different ways about being concerned about the same thing. Yep. But we classified it as economic catastrophe brought on by massive federal government overreach. And then this is more me than Peter, disastrous foreign policy is my big concern, that I see this as a big problem. Why is this a big problem? Well, I'm having trouble having the same paycheck do what I need to do for my family. It's becoming more difficult. I remember my wife, she's not very political. And when we didn't vote for Biden, and when he won, what she said was, well, it's not a big deal. I mean, when was the last time that that really changed our life? Someone that we don't agree with getting elected. How does that, how that never changed our life? And she, and it just a few months ago, or maybe a couple months ago, I think we were in the grocery store and we were looking around to see all these the prices. And she said, oh my gosh, I was wrong. This has been a big, this has been a big difference that we're seeing. And maybe we're putting the blame on the wrong places. I think, Michael, you'll probably be able to point out to this, but what I'm perceiving here is, Peter, you can talk more about federal government overreach, but my focus is more on foreign policy driving what we're seeing right now. I mean, we know it as the phrase Putin's price hike. That's come from the White House, that phrase. And I know that some people on the right say that that's a ridiculous term. I don't really think it's ridiculous. I think there is a lot to be said about the fact that Russia and Ukraine are at war. However, I think Peter and I actually had a podcast about this. We carry a lot of the blame for Russia and Ukraine being at war, in my mind. I think we decided to pull out of Afghanistan in a way that was overly partisan, which showed American weakness and disorganization. And I think it was no accident that within months of that, Putin decides to invade Ukraine. And then I also further think that the economic sanctions that we put on Russia came too late after boots were already in the ground, which caused us to cause the sanctions to not take effect. Furthermore, we thought that we could crater Russia's economy, which would make them not want to stay in Ukraine. Unfortunately, Russia's economy is based on oil. And because we do not export enough oil, domestically, or we do not produce enough oil domestically, we rely upon really bad people like Putin or some other people to supply us oil. And the Russian ruble is doing fine now. Their economy is actually doing great. And so they're actually being rewarded for their terrible actions that they've done, the human rights abuse that we see in Ukraine, which I think is terrible. And so I really find that the Putin's price hike is something that we're responsible for. And it's really upsetting me. At 9.1% inflation, it's getting more and more difficult to have a family. And I'm very, very concerned about it. I don't want to jump into how I think we can fix it. Michael, feel free to stop me if there's any time where you think that you want to point out something, or you can wait to the end, whichever you think is better.
Yeah, no, I'm just taking it all in.
Okay. Peter, I think you wanted to speak more specifically towards federal government overreach. What is your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that I totally agree with that just looking at going to the grocery store, going to the gas station, you feel and see the effect of 9.1% inflation. Because I mean, just even me, like I'm making more money than I did last year. Getting raises and advancing, but my spending power has gone down. So it's like, am I actually moving up in the world or not? So it's kind of like you really feel that effect. And I think that obviously all of our economies are tied in together, and so you have wars over in Europe that's really affecting us in a terrible way. But I also do think that our federal government here in the United States has become, in my view, way too large and way too powerful in terms of what it can do domestically. My understanding of the federal government has always been something that it's designed to basically keep the peace amongst the states and designed to be able to represent the states on the global field. So like going to war and engaging in international trade. But I think that the federal government has way too much turned its view inward as well, to regulating the states and trying to tell the states what's best for them. I always think that, like, I'm a huge fan of smaller government. And so I think that the more local the form of government, the better off the people are. And in a perfect world, I don't think we would have a federal government, but obviously we have to have a federal government, because just acknowledging the reality on the ground. But I think that you see, and it's not just in the United States, the federal government's kind of seizing massive amounts of power from I think the power that belongs to the people. Like you see it in, I think it's the Netherlands, with all the Netherlands farmers who are protesting government's seizing of their land for the government's own purposes. And that's part of a greater thing that's going on throughout the EU. And so I think it affects the person on the ground, like the farmer or the business owner, the small business owner. These people know they're there living their lives, and they know what is best for their community. And I think for the vast majority of the time, the federal government doesn't know what's best for the local communities. And that's why I think it should be left to local rule. And so I think, what's that?
Can you give me an example just so I can understand better what you're saying of how the federal government is overreaching specifically in the United States, though?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the COVID lockdowns was a major example of that. Like I could definitely understand COVID at first, when no one really knew what was going on, not sure what was happening. But I think that the federal government and then state governments, they kept the lockdowns on for too extreme for too long. And so that it just completely destroyed so many businesses, especially small business owners, who didn't have like the reserve cash in order to continue operating and to survive that. So that really it affected and destroyed businesses and destroyed families, not to mention the people's mental health from being kind of in lockdown for so long. So that's definitely what I would see as a major example of a government overreaching its limits there.
And just to jump in there, I feel like I took a lot of swipes at the current administration during my my first few points that I made. And I want to jump in on the past administration here. I think that as an example of federal government overreach, the shutdowns of COVID, and then what the solution was to release trillions of dollars. Really not release, print trillions of dollars, which that was under Trump's watch that happened, who obviously was a Republican. So, and when he did that, in my mind, I was like, well, we're going to be feeling that effect for years to come. When you just print out money like that, this is the trickle down effects is 9.1 inflation at this point. So I thought that was not a good decision then, and it feels like a less good decision now. Now, I think we can argue other sides, but I think that, Michael, that'll probably be it. We'll leave that to you for us. But do you want to stop us here, Michael, or maybe we can talk about difference?
Sure. I am no expert when it comes to foreign policy or economic policy by any means. What I am, though, is I consider myself kind of an international citizen. So I try to pay attention to what's happening around the world every bit as much as I try to pay attention to what's happening in this country. And so, one of the things that I think a lot of Americans just aren't aware of is that America isn't unique in terms of its struggle with inflation. And so we're at 9.1%. Well, it turns out so is England. England's at 9.1%. Canada's at 8-point-something%. Russia's at 14.1%. So we're right there in the mix. I think France has a pretty decent inflation rate right now of just under 6%. But everybody's feeling this. Yes. I think Mexico has a slightly better inflation rate than either the United States or Canada. You go into South America, good golly,
Argentina.
So I think it's a little disingenuous for anyone to blame the current administration or even the past administration. I mean, yes, presidents can have policies that will affect inflation for sure, right? And I don't know if it was Forbes. I think it was Forbes is not exactly a bastion of liberal publications, right? But it was saying that the amount of debt racked up just by the Trump administration, and I'm kind of speaking to Peter's notion of government overreach, boy, it was incredible, wasn't it? What happened under Trump's presidency, the national debt we incurred. Now, in terms of federal debt accumulated by presidents, I think Obama accumulated a little bit more than Trump, not much, but then Bush and Clinton prior to those two was almost nothing, so it's a famous whipping boy for either side, right? Like Clinton said, it's the economy, stupid. Well, yeah, so we love to use the other side of the aisle as our great kind of, they're our scapegoat. Man, if the economy isn't doing well, the poor president who's in charge is going to get nailed. But if you start to get I think, a little more global perspective, you realize things like COVID, which incidentally, a large proportion of the Republican Party denied even existed at the beginning. It really, you realize, gosh, a president can only have so much control over, because we're a global economy now, right? So it's that idea of the theory of chaos, a butterfly flaps its wings in South America can eventually cause a tsunami in the Philippines. So we're so interconnected that I do think it too often devolves into partisan rancor,ing. And someone who knows far more than I could give a far more eloquent response to the details that you guys talked about. But I just think, we're all struggling with inflation. America is not unique in that regard. And by comparison, we're doing okay compared to the rest of the world. Does that automatically take someone like Joe Biden off the hook? Certainly not, because as you both have indicated, though I may see the role of federal government a little bit differently, Peter, than perhaps you articulated it, I would agree with most of what you said. I think it's kind of here to oversee how the states interact with commerce, make sure their laws are somewhat compatible. I mean, this whole overturning Roe thing now has really thrown a wrench into how different states are going to manage this whole Roe v. Wade thing. So I think, my father wrote a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, and I wish I had it with me. I mean, I'm sitting right here in his office, so I probably just reach for his book. But he has a funny line. It's not funny, but I think he was quoting Senator Ernest Hollings, who was a senator back in the 80s. I think, I'm going to muck all this up. Any of your listeners can go right to Google right now and correct me. But I think he was a senator or representative from like North Dakota or something, and a kind of tried and true conservative of the old type of what I would consider the two of you, classical conservatives, not necessarily Trump conservatives, right? In any case, he was complaining about government overreach, and which is, that is a talking point among conservatives for a long, long time. Of course, it's what probably defines the difference between a conservative and liberal for the most part. But it was interesting at the same time that he was complaining about government overreach. My dad it came from a newspaper article. His son or someone he was related to was a beneficiary of the GI Bill. His parents, who were older, were on Social Security and Medicare. Someone had been treated at a VA hospital, so on and so forth. And so, when we're a government of the people, by the people, for the people, I sometimes get a little bit nervous when we have the government over there and the people over here, because some things getting lost in translation. Obviously, it's not working the way it's supposed to work. I mean, that's certainly not what our founders were thinking, was you can say the government over here and the people over here. We're supposed to be a government of the people, by the people, for the people. We elect our representatives. They come into office and presumably are enacting policies that reflect the majority of the country. So I've always been, whether the left wants to say it or the right wants to say it, I've always been a little stymied by that contrast that's being made between government and the rest of us. I know that traditionally, Democrats spend more money on social issues. Republicans spend more money on the industrial military complex, which takes up a huge portion of our national expenditures. But I'm wondering, if you don't mind, this isn't, or maybe it is an evasion and I'm just chickening out, but this speaks to an idea that I was thinking would eventually come up in this conversation. And if I may, I'm just going to pivot for I'll give myself 60 seconds. When we live in a culture where we have to spend trillions of dollars on national defense, and other countries around the world have to spend no one spends as much as we do, but collectively, right? Trillions upon trillions of dollars are spent with missiles aimed at each other. We live in a pretty screwed up world. If we live in a culture where the safest thing to do is arm everyone with a gun, already, before you've even left the starting gate, something is deeply wrong, right? Because when any thoughtful Christian recites the Jesus prayer, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." I always think that whatever policies you support need to be the sort of policies you think will be supported in heaven, because the kingdom's coming here. So, if you happen to think that we shouldn't be aborting fetuses if they won't be doing that in heaven, we probably shouldn't do it here. If you don't think people will be carrying guns in heaven, we probably shouldn't do it here. If you don't think that whatever, you can take any policy from the left or the right and have fun with it.
That's really refreshing to hear you say that. I like that a lot, because there's that tried and true, that's a religious issue that doesn't influence politics at all. That right there, what you just said kind of destroys that argument right there, because you're saying, well, hang on, if it's not in heaven, then we probably shouldn't be voting for it here either. I really like that. That's great.
And I just stumbled across that idea as I was kind of working on the house and building our home, and I've had a lot of time to think. And I started calling it, the Lord's Prayer ethic. If a policy you support, whatever it is, on the right or the left, if you can say the Lord's Prayer with conviction, it's the only prayer he ever taught us to pray, and hold the policy or support a policy you happen to support, then good for you. That's great. That means you're a consistent, thoughtful Christian person. But if you can't, there's reason to take a step back and wonder, you're supporting the right policy. So I'm just reluctant again because we have gotten off on the wrong foot from so many iterations back, that to start pointing fingers at who's responsible for inflation, who's this, that, I just start to think we're probably missing the deeper point here, which is that, anyway, go ahead.
Well, I think that's a good point to make. However, I think the points that you brought up, like some of the points you brought up, I think would be good ones. I'm guessing they're probably ones that you'll bring up when you're talking about the ones that you're really, the issues you're really concerned about, like the gun control issue or the abortion issue or things like that. I think I'm wondering though, am I missing when you say the deeper point, when I say about, okay, I'm really worried about inflation, I'm really worried about our foreign policy. Can you help me see a little bit what is that deeper point maybe that I'm missing?
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. And this is where what I'm about to say may cause such a ruckus among your listeners that you will cut me off and I won't be offended, because we'll still be friends. And Peter, I've hardly known you at all, but I already like you. So we can all make up. And when I go to Texas, you can surreptitiously sneak me out at night for a beer. But I think capitalism is the problem that has caused so many of our quote unquote solutions. It's the initial problem. And I think, I'm not an adherent of the old barter system nationally, because that would just get a little clunky.
Difficult to carry out globally, right?
Difficult to carry out globally. And frankly, before 2 years ago, I had really nothing to offer anyone of any practical things, except I could baptize their babies and bury their grandparents.
That's very
which I suppose some people have made a living doing. But now I can build a house. So, a barter system may not be bad, because I could get my teeth cleaned and I'll build your garage. But I do think, and we all know the boogeyman in the Republican Party is socialism. God forbid anyone supports socialism. But what's so interesting is, just like a democracy, not all democracies are created equal. Not all socialist systems are created equal. And the countries that traditionally have the highest are among the highest, like in the top 5, GDPs, standard of living, they'll do these corny little things. People magazine will do. What are the happiest countries in the world? They're almost always democratic socialist countries like Sweden, Norway, Finland. And those are democratic socialist countries. Now, no one would, when you think socialism, you don't think Denmark, nor at least most people don't, Norway, Sweden. When I think, when I say I'm supportive of a more democratic socialist construct, I immediately am thinking of the Norwegian countries. That's how they operate. Not on the repressively socialist countries like China, and obviously Russia isn't socialist in that regard. It's different. I get nervous about using these terms, but I really think capitalism is a scourge in its present iteration. Is a scourge that needs to be really looked at thoughtfully, and I think this is I didn't vote for Bernie Sanders, but I found that he's a darling of Fox Media. That was so new to me. I couldn't quite wrap my mind around that. People at Fox love Bernie Sanders, and I thought that's so intriguing and kind of lovely. I think that's very sweet.
I didn't know that. Peter and I don't watch Fox.
Well,
so we didn't know that either.
I don't either. But then when I found out that Bernie Sanders was a guest, I watched Fox, and I had a renewed respect for Fox News. But Bernie Sanders, at least he stands up for what he believes. And that boy has his facts, man. And he was taking Lindsey Graham to town. I rarely feel sorry for Lindsey Graham, but I did in that instance. And Bernie Sanders just had facts coming off his, he's just about how much oil companies are making. And the last time a barrel was $113 a barrel, which it is now, gas cost $3.25. Why is gas $6? Why is gas $7? Because the oil companies are getting rich off of it. It's so lovely, when you have someone like that who's just a conscience. So I think capitalism is a problem. And now we can talk about solutions if we accept that capitalism is the system we've got. So let's deal with it, Bruner. Suck it up. Don't be a whiner. Just deal with it. Then we can talk about solutions. But I think they're all interim solutions until we find a more equitable distribution of wealth. And right now, you guys live in a state, I used to live in, I'm currently in a state where the inequities are almost greatest, right? New York, Texas, California, there's some huge inequities here, and that's not biblical. And so I want to think outside the box and say, do we have to accept Republican, Democrat? Do we have to accept capitalist or socialist? Or can we be creative as thoughtful Christians? And this is where I think the Catholic Church has done a lovely job of being, not always historically, but I think recently. Vatican II was a thoughtful reappropriation of kind of how to, anyway, I could go on and on. But I think we could spend a lot of time talking about temporary solutions. But I think we need to go back to first principles and say, should credit card companies be charging 25% that's what's killing people. Should you're opening a Pandora's box at this point. It's pretty scary.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to spend all our time on this first point, but I do want to say before diving in, I think I was thinking more very specific things that I would like to see happen to fix our economy. I was thinking you need to sit down with Putin. You need to sit down with Zelensky. You need to isolate China from Putin and Zelensky. You need to very specifically say, this war needs to end. We're going to orchestrate this war. And it needs to end tomorrow. And the reason why America needs to do that is because we cannot have a World War III happen like that. This would be just, we're headed the wrong direction here. And then I also think that we need to look more thoughtfully towards how we, okay, here's an example. Texas had a terrible snowstorm last year. Yeah. And our energy grid was not ready for it. Yeah. We need to be more thoughtful about how we rely on our energy. We need to break down this whole partisan thing where, there's the green energy versus, the not green energy. It just needs to be what works. And then we need to think about the poor side, the poor factions who can't afford these incredible price hikes. Our energy went up by 50% this year. It's insane. Like that, a 50% increase in energy just seems I'm not experiencing 9.1 inflation. I'm experiencing way more than that.
Yeah.
So I think we need to find a way to agree. Everyone wants to have a cool house in the summer and a warm house in the winter. Okay, let's figure out how we can do that. I think that both sides disagree on everything right now, and that just there doesn't seem to be any reason for it. Everyone wants cheap energy. I want cheap energy. I love the idea of electrical vehicles. I can't afford one, but I'd love the idea of one. But I don't think that necessarily that gets fixed by executive order. I think something that I'm going to come back to quite a bit is that our congressmen need to be stronger. We need to, when we elect them, they need to have a mandate that they need to agree on something and put it into place. For example, when was the last time we had a declaration of war? And yet, how often have we had our troops overseas fighting? Like, that's because we have a weak Congress. Our Congress is supposed to represent us. And yet we have a dictator that's elected every 4 years that makes all the decisions. It's ridiculous. Like, I'm going to probably come back to this on a lot of different things. But I think very specifically, we need to elect strong congressmen that actually, we hold their feet to the fire because they went out and they did something. And if it's not working, they get voted out of office. And they get voted out of office every 2 years, which I think is great. I like how our founder set up the 2-year thing. That might be a bad, you might disagree about that. So Peter, go ahead.
May I just interject? I agree that we have these, I wish we had term limits so that they didn't serve ad infinitum. And I wish we weren't gerrymandering our voting districts, because now there's almost no chance of these people being voted out because they represent their particular constituency. And both sides, I'm trying to be as equitable as I can here, have been engaged in massive gerrymandering.
Oh yeah.
So
that's nothing new.
The idea that anyone at this point is going to get voted out is almost humorous, right? Some will, but good golly. So Peter, James was pivoting to you, so I don't want to interrupt.
Thank you. Peter, why don't you jump in real quick? I want to, Michael, I'm not going to gloss over what you said. You dropped a bombshell. I want to come back to it. But I want to very quickly let Peter have a chance to say, what are some of the changes that you can see for what our initial problem was?
And I think that this is something that probably I'm guessing that we can all agree on, and that's bringing back our faith into how we run our country, right? How we approach other countries as well. And I forget which encyclical it was, but back in like 1800s, I think it was, is it Humanae Vitae? I don't know. But when we had first the capitalism versus socialism kind of arguments arising, the Pope wrote an encyclical, which I've read, and I'm sorry I can't remember the name of it right now, but I think it did a beautiful job of kind of portraying the church's stance on what the church's stance should be in this kind of debate. Because rather than siding with like capitalism or socialism, it's siding with the human person.
Yes. And
how they're affected by different forms of economic forms and different businesses, and how it really delves into how even in capitalism, which it tends to have different huge monopolies and the different businesses that take advantage of the worker. That is a tendency that happens, and in the encyclical, it's saying like that is something that we have to reject. That is, we cannot squash the little person in the hopes of, in this grand dream of like building some kind of empire out of your business. So I think that and you see it. You see examples of capitalism abused everywhere. But I think that it's really important to, what we can do now is we have this capitalist system, which has done really great things for our country, in my view. but I think that you need to re-imbue it with that understanding of the human person and the person's dignity and value each person has. So rather than seeing them as assets or as numbers that you can use to your advantage, seeing them as real human persons with families and children, and realizing that every move that you make as a business owner, as a politician, it affects those people and their lives. So just a return to using our faith to kind of guide our politics and policies, especially when it comes to capitalism, I think would do us a lot of good.
Question. Yeah, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I totally agree with what you're saying, Peter. And I really do think that returning to at least biblical principles, right? Because it's hard in a country that fought a revolution against required religion, right? To call us a Christian country in some ways is to slap our hand across the face of the American Revolution. But I agree that at least traditionally understood principles of economy, justice, those sorts of things need to be re-embraced. And I think capitalism has done awfully good things for a huge portion of the country, for sure. But as I look at it as a more global person, it's also wreaked a lot of havoc with some of our neighboring countries, some of our trading partners. And we're the United States is in some ways taking religious ideas completely out of the question, kind of a historical accident, a fabulous accident in many respects, but very unique, but I think capitalism has certainly worked for a portion of our electorate, for sure. And I think capitalism in general has helped to usher in a lot of wonderful things that have happened. But as you say, it needs to be managed and managed carefully, just like money needs to be managed and managed carefully, or it can become a weapon.
I guess question for both of you then on this idea. I think what I'm hearing you both say is we need to, in our government, have a greater understanding for treating a human person as a human person, which entails a greater respect for really that this person is made in the image and likeness of God, because we're Christians and that's what we believe. I don't want to oversimplify, but am I hearing what you're saying?
For me, it's more, it's not just politics and for politicians, but it's mainly, to me, in my view, for businessmen, people who manage businesses, because they're the ones that, they make the decisions that directly impact, their employees' lives. So I think that it really, this is not so much a policy view, but more of a call from a Christian and even just a faith-based view of reminding, living this out ourselves, and also reminding our community of business leaders that these are human beings, and we're all in this together, kind of.
We're all in this together. And you were mentioning the encyclical. Was it the John Paul II encyclical, like in 1999? That one?
No, so that's a much later one. I'm sure that he kind of revisited that, okay. But I'm thinking of something. This is from like the 1800s. I'm sorry, I couldn't remember.
Fair enough.
I think it might be Rerum Novarum.
I think it probably is that. I think it's probably that. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, because Pope Francis has had some things to say about market capitalism too that aren't too favorable.
Rerum Novarum, 1891 by Pope Leo the 13th.
Okay, yeah, that's, to your question, James, I mean, for me, yes, the answer is yes. It's seeing human beings as created in the likeness of God, right, in the image of God, across the entire spectrum, from womb to tomb, so that for me, as someone trying to be a thoughtful Christian, and I'm not always successful at it. In fact, probably I'm often not very successful, but my heart is usually in the right place. I think, again, we need to support human dignity, not human dignity, not seen on its own merits, but seen in our relationship to God, because that's where we get our dignity. we were driving down from Washington to California this last week, and we drove through parts of the Central Valley in California, and my kids were able to see all the migrant farm workers working out in the fields. And we really had a really interesting, I have a son who's 10 and a daughter who's 16, and it was a living sociology class, living social studies class. And I said, a huge portion of those migrant farm workers are undocumented. Without them, we would cease to have the food production we have in this country. It would just come to a crashing halt. And I said, so it gets really complicated when we're talking. I was telling my kids this, really complicated when we're talking about how to deal with the immigration issue and what do we do with our borders and how do we secure them so that they're meaningful, but at the same time give people dignity. How do we do that? What do we do about the child in the womb? What do we do about the person on death row who has done apparently, heinous things, although now we're finding that a certain percentage of people on death row are actually innocent. So what do we do in honor of this Imago Dei? A former senator from Oregon, Mark Hatfield, a Republican, was a proponent of what he called the radical life belief position, which is different than, if anyone Googles radical life, please do not mistake what you find in that Google search for what I'm saying here. But radical life idea of we support life at all of its stages from womb to tomb. So he was against euthanasia. He was against capital punishment. He was against abortion. He was against repressive and rapacious economic policies that hurt the poor. I'm 100% in favor of that idea.
Okay.
And if we can form our economies and our governments around the idea of the Imago Dei, we would stop demonizing each other, first of all. We would stop, demonizing our opponents. In fact, we're called to do the opposite. We're called to love our enemy. And too often, I have to say, I've seen from my Republican brothers and sisters in the church, not a whole lot of loving of enemies going on. I see it among my far left, usually atheistic friends, or they go to a church so nominally Christian that it's just basically a social club. And there's a lot of hating going on both sides. I find it reprehensible, embarrassing, and sometimes I'm tempted to start thinking that all the crap we're going through is part of God's punishment on all of us.
Because it's possible. That's
for
quite
what
possible.
we're doing to each other.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's. My dad used to say things similar about when bad things happened. But real quickly,
When bad things happen to bad people. Yeah.
Well, not to necessarily bad people, but like the wages of sin or death is kind of how he would put it.
Yeah.
But okay, I'd like to get a little bit specific because on theory, I'm agreeing with what you both are saying, but I'm wondering if in practice I would still do it. So you mentioned, Michael, the places of like Finland, Norway, Sweden, like those countries, the Northern European countries. I'm not saying that capitalism is perfect. I would never say that because it's not. But I am very allergic to the word socialism because
Sure. Well, of course.
I think it's a very flawed theory that's caused a lot of problems. Can you give me some examples of specific things that Denmark, Finland, or some like that you would like to see happen here that work?
The Scandinavian countries, yeah. So universal healthcare for one. Universal access to college for another. There's a higher taxing rate for income tax, so that there's less of this really, I think, egregious difference between the very rich and the very poor. You don't have that issue in the Scandinavian countries nearly to the extent we have it in the States. I think there's a kind of built in to a lot of this kind of Scandinavian mindset is this idea, and I think one of you said it earlier, Peter, perhaps you said it, we're all in this together. We're all in this together. So what's good for the gander is good for the goose, right? It's the other way around. What's really good for most people should be what we're shooting for. But we have this, I think, misunderstanding of trickle-down economics, which just doesn't, on paper, really doesn't happen to the extent I think it should, or it's billed to happen. So I would like to see some of those classically socialist, and of course, James, I totally get it. Of course, you're going to have allergic reaction to socialism, partly because Heidegger was right? Martin Heidegger, his whole idea was we all are born into a pre-interpreted reality. None of us is tabula rasa. None of us has like a perfectly objective view of what's going on in the world. So we're all, and how we were raised, who our friends were, where we went to college, what we do for a living, all of those things affect what we view. So how can you be a God-fearing Republican and not be allergic to socialism as a word? I wouldn't understand that. But as I said earlier, not all socialism, just like not all democracies, are created equal. And a democratic socialist structure, for me, makes so much intrinsic sense. It's what Bernie Sanders is all about for the most part. It just makes so much sense. Now, how practical is it? It's debatable. I don't know how well we could do that. It would have to be incremental steps for sure. But, we're the only industrial country in the world that charges such incredibly high bills for medical care, for insurance, for college. So America, listen, I was born and raised in the Philippines under the Marcos regime, for God's sakes. And we supported him. Both administrations, Republican and Democrat, supported this terrible, terrible man who raped his country financially. So I don't have this John Winthrop city on a hill view of the United States of America. I just don't. I think I have a very realistic view of our country. It is, it's very Dickensian. It was the best of things. It was the worst of things. So I don't feel any inkling at all to defend America right or wrong. And I don't think you guys do either. We do a lot of things right, and we do a lot of things wrong. And we just all need to be grown up big boys and girls about it and say, okay, what are some of the things we do wrong? And let's get rid of Republican and Democrat and all that crazy nonsense that's just a distraction. And let's really talk, as you want to do, James, and I think it's right. Let's talk about the practical things. How do we make this work? How do we make this happen? But right now, don't you guys think we're in a political system where there are so many trigger words being thrown around that we can't have a decent adult conversation? I mean, I don't want to teach at the university anymore because there's so many freaking trigger words from both the right and the left. I'd be fired in 2 weeks. I mean, what the frick is learning but a big, big trigger? It's one big trigger. That's what it means to be alive and be awake and be an adult and be grown up and have a spine, is you deal with triggers, for God's sakes. But not that I feel strongly about that. But anyway,
not at all, right? Not at all.
Flipping crazy. And I've contributed absolutely nothing of substance in the last 5 minutes. I've just been ranting. But
I want to.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
I want to talk.
Rescue this conversation, James. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. I don't want to spend too much more time on this point because there's other problems that we want to get to, and I want to know more about what worries you, Michael. So we want to get to you. So let me just say, I'm open to hearing ideas that the Scandinavian countries that do well. However, I'm worried because the ideas that you mentioned right now specifically require spending more money, which I'm hearing and then also raising taxes.
Yeah,
that's the concern. Like my whole hope right now is we spend less money and lower taxes because both of those things are killing me. That the government spending too much money and inflation getting higher and higher, the influx of cash, and then the tax rate is not great. I fight my property taxes all the time.
Yeah. This is the problem with capitalism, my friend, is that you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. We have what's our national debt right now? I mean, it's ridiculous. So the idea of the government spending more money seems absolutely ludicrous.
Right.
And yet, how do we lower taxes and lower spending at the same time? We're the ones, you and me, the three of us, and 300 million other people,
right,
who fund this enterprise. Well, are we going to fund it by free will donations? It ain't going to happen. I mean, I had the opportunity. I'm buying some tickets to London, to a London National Train Museum, and they give you 6 boxes to tick on. And 4 of them are various donations you give, and then 2 of them are you can just get in for free. Well, like a good capitalist, we hit the free ones. I don't want to pay. I've already paid enough money to go over the pond. I'm not going to pay. So I think, how do you lower taxes and decrease spending? I just think I see them, in my ignorance, as being completely at odds with each other.
Really? I don't, to me, it makes sense though. But it
does
makes
it? Okay, maybe so. What I mean by completely at odds with each other is it's at odds when I'm assuming that we want to lift the general electorate up. We want to lift the living conditions of everyone up. That's where it seems like a contradiction in terms, because so many people, you guys, are in desperate straits, not just the migrant farm workers that were working the fields so that I could have my nice Bordeaux. Well, that's okay. That's a bad wine thing because we don't grow Bordeaux in this country. My nice Merlot. I mean, you guys, really? I mean, minimum wage. We have families in Spokane, 2 families, the mom and the dad, both working full-time jobs, minimum wage, and they can't afford an apartment. What kind of system is this?
Yeah.
Where 2 hardworking people making, and minimum wage is supposed to be the wage that's the minimum that allows you a decent lifestyle. That is not happening. So someone has to step in and do an intervention. How are we going to do that?
And I think the way that I think we agree that there's a huge problem. And I think the way that we disagree is I don't think that the government is capable of fixing this problem. Are we capable of it, do you think? Well, I think what we need to go back to is more the strong communities that we used to have. We need to know our neighbors. We need to actually work with our church that feeds people that need food. We need to actually go back to. And so why aren't we? Well, I know that we do. Like Michelle and I do, but I do know that most people
why
don't.
Aren't most of us?
Yeah.
Do you mind if I hop in there?
Yeah.
I mean, what I've kind of seen, at least in throughout college and living in different places, something that I've picked up on a little bit is that a lot of people really do view the government as something that can solve all the problems. Mm-hmm. And so they get really upset when the government doesn't solve the problems, and they're like, well, that means that the system is broken, that this is not working, and the system might be broken, systems might be broken. But I think that kind of going back to what James was just saying and what I was saying earlier, you can solve a lot of the problems in your community and in your with your churches and with your different clubs and different community things that you have. You can help the poor. You can do meaningful things to feed the poor, to house and clothe the poor, to help immigrants. All these different things that you can have an actual tangible effect on your community. And I think that the reason so many people don't do it is because that they're thinking that they're waiting for someone else to do it, and they expect the government to be the one doing all of it. And if the government's not doing it, then it's up to you. And so I think what too many people kind of look to the government as in many ways as a god that is going to solve all the problems by telling them exactly what they need to do and how much of it they need to do in order for the world to be fixed. And I don't think that's realistic.
Yeah, and I don't either, Peter. What's fascinating, and I agree, what's fascinating to me is you have kind of one of two sides, right? Or two sides of this. People who think the government is evil and we just need to get rid of it, and the people who think the government is the savior and they're going to solve all our problems. And of course, 3 of us are intelligent enough to know the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? It's not evil. It's not the savior. It's not God. It's not the devil. But what's interesting to me, and I agree, Peter, and and you're making an old classical argument, right? And this is where I would be more tendency on the left of center. You guys might be on the right of center. I don't have a lot of faith in human nature, and I learned that from Sunday school. And so when you say, and I think the operative word you were using, and I think you were absolutely right, and you finished the point exactly. My opinion, exactly correct. We can do all these things. Can, coulda, shoulda, woulda, right? But we don't. Now, the last time I checked, the country has been roughly divided, Democrats and Republicans, for about 50 years. Well, if we've wonky Democrats, and I will take your criticism justly. I think I maybe tend to overthink the government can do things. So, forget me and my spineless Democrat friends who just keep waiting for the government to do it. But what about you Republicans? You've had 50 years to do this just on your own. Civic, Rotary clubs, churches. What happened? And so it must be that Republicans and Democrats alike. Oh, well, let's just toss out the silly Republican Democrat nonsense. You guys, I don't want to push your podcast into oblivion because maybe it depends on Republican Democrat, but I don't think it should. Just get rid of, we're all sinners. We don't do it. And we should. And may I quote G.K. Chesterton, James?
Absolutely.
The Christian faith has not been tried and found wanting. It has been left untried because it is difficult. You know why we don't do it, Peter? Republicans and Democrats alike? Why churches just aren't up to the task? Why Rotary clubs and government? I'll tell you why we don't do it. Because we're sinners. Because we need intervention of some kind. And I think that the democratic government experience, that experiment that the United States invented, essentially, is the best governmental experiment ever invented.
I agree with that.
And I think we make tons of mistakes, but given the options, it's pretty awesome. Now, if you were to adopt some democratic socialist policies from Scandinavian countries, you wouldn't be doing anything against the Constitution whatsoever. You could still have our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. So I just don't think we don't do it. And we need checks and balances. It's called the 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
It's called government intervention sometimes. And so I agree with you. I think we agree more than we disagree. There are some things the government can help and should help. It's the only one that can do it. But there are some places where the government really needs to take a step back, and we need to let local communities figure it out. So I would agree in principle.
Okay, well, let's move on. I think I'm going to jettison. Do you still have time, Michael? We haven't even.
Man, I've got all day. No, I don't have all day, but I have some time.
Okay, good. Well, let's see if we can go a little bit faster. We'll try and do one more point. No. We'll try and do. Peter and I will try and do one more point, and then we can get to. Hopefully, I want to hear more about what really concerns you. I really want to know. Okay, so. Peter, I'll let you take more lead with this one. Michael, you already spoke about it quite a bit about Roe versus Wade. You spoke about this. So I think another concern that Peter and I have, and we realize that we're in a minority here. I think it's just 10% that have this as one of their highest concerns, is abortion. Peter, I think you have a lot more data at your hands. So can you explain more about why we're concerned about abortion, and then what you think we should do?
Yeah, I mean, so I had this as one of my topics. Is definitely abortion has been and will continue to be one of my major concerns, and I think it is the greatest evil of our day, honestly, and that is because we have, since abortion became legal nationally in 1973, over 60 million dead Americans. Which it just blows so many other wars and plagues and sicknesses. It blows everything out of the water. And I think that is the main evil. The reason that this is an evil and such a travesty is because it is something that we are actively allowing and doing in our country. And so, we touched on a little bit about the overturn of Roe v. Wade and how that's kind of it's caused a lot of confusion, a lot of chaos is going on. But personally, I do think that it's a wonderful thing that Roe v. Wade was overturned because it does return the abortion question back to the states, which I'm always a bigger fan of deciding things on more of a local level. The reason I think that it continues to be a major issue is because it's still happening. It's still happening in the country, and there's still babies being aborted. And I think that at this point, it would be, it's pretty difficult to argue scientifically that a fetus is not a human being. There are arguments that can still be had because it's something that science has developed since 1973, and the argument is developing as well. But I think that it is difficult to know what we know and to say that a fetus is not a human. And if we really truly believe that, then that is just a single instance of one of those human beings being killed, and that being legal in our country, to me, is just an insane travesty.
And what solutions do you present here?
So I think that, again, I'm always a big fan of more of the local kind of thing. And so I think that in also sticking with the theme of kind of living out our faith in our policies and our politics. And this is not just Christianity. I think that the majority of the religions kind of would agree. In fact, in Texas, at least the only religion that's really gung-ho for abortion is the Satanists. It's the Satanist church has sued Texas multiple times in the last few years for pro-life laws that have been passed. And so what the solution is, I think that these states need to take the steps that they need to take in order to protect life. And Texas, it's not perfect, but I think Texas has done a lot of really amazing things for this issue and for this cause. Obviously, we caused a whole ton of controversy last year with the Texas Heartbeat Act, and that, it banned abortion after 6 weeks when a heartbeat is detectable. And that is what everyone talks about, and that's what caused all the controversy. But what a lot of people don't talk about and is less known is that within that same legislative session that Texas passed the Texas Heartbeat Act, they also doubled the state budget for resources for pregnant mothers and for families. It's called the Alternatives to Abortion Program, and they doubled that budget to $100 million. And so that program, it funds like a huge network of different pregnancy resource centers, maternity homes, and all these different things that offer aid for free to women who are going through like difficult pregnancy situations. And then it continues to connect them with different social services that will help them be able to choose life, and also to have a good life after doing that. And so,
we need to try and get to Michael here. So I want to say just real quickly, what you're summing up here is that you believe that abortion be decided state by state, the legality of it, and then should a state decide to make abortion illegal, then the state will need to find a way to support these mothers that are in difficult pregnancies. Is that
right?
Kind of?
That's not exactly what I'm saying, but that the gist of it is that we need to be able to have laws that defend life, and then also not just discard the situation, discard the family and the mother after that. Saying like you can't kill the baby, but we're also going to do something. We are taking steps in order that you're not left in a hopeless situation after that.
All right. I'm going to, in the interest of time, not add to that anything. I think there are some things I would add, but basically I agree with what you just said. Michael, could you kind of tell us where we're missing out?
Well, I don't know if you are missing anywhere. What's interesting, though, is so I used to be pro-choice. And then I read an article by Naomi Wolf in the New Republic magazine, again, not a denizen of conservative writing. And I began the article pro-choice and ended the article pro-life. So that was not Naomi Wolf's intention, I can assure you. And why I did was because she said, and I could understand why she was saying this. She said, we need to reclaim the moral high ground. We've allowed the Republicans to claim this moral high ground. And so the first step in doing that is we have to admit that when abortions happen, something is being killed. And we need to be honest about what that is, right? And as I read through her article, this would have been in 1997 or so, 98. I thought to myself, wow, that's so true. That's so consistent. But she's just convinced me that this is a terrible, terrible thing. I grew up in a home, that's always championed the feminist movement. I think women should have been given more rights, the right to vote among them and the right to work and all the rest. But I think that's become a terribly misguided direction we've gone for many reasons that have actually hurt the equality of women. So I was very much just I was about to say from the womb. Isn't that ironic? From the womb, pro-choice. That make almost like a comic. From the womb, I've been pro-choice.
That's about as much as a Nazi Jew right there.
Yeah, that's pretty funny. But it's a very serious thing because many people I love and respect, some of whom I'm quite close to, are pro-choice, and I understand why. They don't see themselves as baby killers. They would never go out and kill anyone's baby. They don't do that. They just don't happen to believe that someone becomes a person at conception or at 6 weeks or at 15 weeks or whatever. They have different views of this. Most Americans statistically believe that there should be some access to abortion in extreme cases if the mother's life is in danger or as a consequence of rape. But other than those two, we need to be very careful about using abortion as birth control. Right. That's just so awful. But so I'm a pro-life person who did not support the overturn of Roe v. Wade, which again can sound like an obvious contradiction. But the reason I didn't is because for me, at the end of the day, what can we do to limit abortions? That's my main goal. That's what I want. I think overturning Roe v. Wade from this pretty activist court, Supreme Court, was really legislating morality. It was trying, because I used to give an assignment to my students at APU. It was a writing class, and they had to pick an issue that they felt strongly about and be willing to do research on it and then write a paper on it. But the trick I pulled with these students is I didn't tell them that after they found the issue and they'd done research on it, that they had to write their final paper in defense of the opposite position, in which, everyone hated me. But they learned something as a result. But what was interesting is the papers that were written on abortion, and easily 10 to 15 to 20% of the papers would be written on this issue. They really did come to a place where they were forced to stop demonizing the opposition. That's the first thing we need to do. And then they started to understand, this is a really, really tricky, slippery slope because, gosh, what does the Bible say about conception? We all know the Psalms. I knitted you in your mother's womb. I knew you before you were born. But then there was this notion of there was a certain point at which, it's tricky. It's not univocal, right? It's kind of it's a little bit, we're having to really wrestle with the text. And we don't live in a Christian country where we're not a theocracy, we're a democracy. So how can we best change the hearts and minds of people so that we have fewer and fewer and fewer abortions? I want to save the lives of that person in the womb, right? But I also know that rapacious policies can kill people. We can kill people once they're born if we support economically rapacious policies that disproportionately affect the poor. I'm simply saying then what I'm trying to say in all of this is it's a complicated issue. I happen to stand on the pro-life side. I happen to believe that the Roman Catholic Church kind of has it right on this. I'm still a bit agnostic about when life precisely begins, Does it begin at conception or not? But I tend to favor very restricted abortion policy, so that if the mother's life is in danger, then we have to choose the lesser of two evils, it seems to me. If the pregnancy is the result of rape, I can't imagine, because I'm not a woman, I can't imagine requiring a woman to carry that baby to term and what she would have to deal with for the rest of her life. There's so many issues. So I want to just be really careful when I talk to my Christian brothers and sisters and my friends who disagree with me. I want to say, can we all agree that there's too much sex out of wedlock in this country to begin with? It's just, we live in a sexually prurient culture where people are just hooking up and sleeping around like crazy. It's no wonder our abortion rate is so high, because so many people are getting pregnant. But this is another issue where I don't think we can tackle the abortion issue as thoughtfully and carefully as we can until we tackle some of the other preceding issues. Like, why do we have such a prurient secular culture that encourages hooking up to begin with? So I want to, and disproportionately, abortion affects poor people more than wealthy people. And so I want to find a way, and I love that you were referring, Peter, to that policy in Texas that wanted to give more money to pregnant women, to give them support. We need to change our policies on adoption so that it's not so incredibly expensive to adopt a child. We need to work on the whole policy related to where children are parentless and they're brought in to families. Pardon me?
The foster system?
The foster care system is broken. So to me, it's a much larger problem than simply abortion, though I think I agree with you, 60 million is a travesty. But what can we do holistically to start changing the hearts and minds of people? And I worry that this decision by the Supreme Court will be a Pyrrhic victory, Pyrrhic, P-H-Y-R-I-C-C. It will end up hurting the cause of abortion in the long run because it will galvanize those on the left.
I want to jump in and ask. So you say you saw it as legislating, that the court, it was an activist court that was going about legislating through their decision. Can you say more about that? Like how were they legislating?
Yeah, I guess technically they're not the legislative branch, right?
Right. No. So they shouldn't be. I agree with that. They shouldn't be legislating, but I'm just not sure how they work.
I'm glad you asked, because it brings up a question I had for Peter related to the question you've just asked me, James. It sounds to me, Peter, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you use the term fan of local. You're a fan of local or whatever, local policy, local government, right? All overturning Roe v. Wade did is it didn't make abortion illegal in this country. It just left it to the states. But it sounds to me, if I'm hearing you correctly, Peter, you think this is America's abiding sin, and yet at the same time you say you're a fan of the local option, knowing fully well that there are states that will allow abortion. It sounds to me like you actually want government, a federal decision to be made to make all abortion illegal. So in that sense, you wouldn't necessarily be a fan of the local option, right? But correct me if I'm misunderstanding you, but I don't quite understand how someone can say, and I agree with you, it is, I think, awful awful doesn't even begin to say it, how many babies have been aborted. But how can one say that and then say they're also a fan of letting the states decide?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that that's a great question. But definitely, so putting aside that Roe v. Wade, the decision itself was judicial overreach and then also federal government overreach, in my view, because we did have states like Texas where abortion was illegal before Roe v. Wade, and then the federal government, coming from the Supreme Court, was saying that states couldn't have laws prohibiting abortion up till this point, and then it was moved by Planned Parenthood versus Casey. So it was as a moving line.
Right.
And so the overturn of Roe v. Wade returns that abortion question to the states. Now, I think that it will be interesting to see what will happen from here. Because obviously you'll have states like Texas they've already illegalized abortion starting at conception. And then you have states like California, where we used to all live, where they've expanded abortion. And now they're like providing state funds for other people from other states to travel to California for abortions. And so in my view, I would like to see kind of what the pro-life movement is capable of doing on the state level, and being able to increase laws that on the state level that do protect life. But you still do have states like California who are incentivizing people to, they're not just allowing abortion. I think in many ways they're incentivizing abortion. And so to me, that falls within this idea of the federal government being able to make sure the states aren't destroying each other, right? So if you have, you don't want something like a civil war, so you need a federal government that's strong enough to keep the states from fighting against each other. But if you have something like abortion, where if we do believe that these are human beings that are being killed, and then you do have states like California that are incentivizing abortions and paying for other people from other states like Texas to come have abortions, then I think that if that is something that persists, a problem that continues, that is something that I think a federal law is something that I'm not sure I would support it. We don't know what's going to happen, but I think that's a question that's worth visiting, of whether or not the federal government should do something to protect preborn life.
I think, could I jump in too?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that the question you posited, Michael, just to restate it, how can you be kind of for smaller government, more federalism, but then also, I think you asked it as if, well, then you should probably, if you think abortion's so bad, don't you think that the federal government should outlaw abortion, right? How can you have
potentially being provocative?
Right. But those are the two questions, like sides. So I'm not sure the two are mutually exclusive, being for a smaller government and then also be for something that we think is really bad. For example, I think that it was the right call for slavery to be abolished. And I think slavery is a really bad thing. But at the same time, I'm also pro smaller government. So I don't think necessarily that the two are, maybe you can tell me, am I wrong? Like that if you—
No. I don't think I was making that argument in general. I was saying that Peter was saying in the same sentence that he thinks abortion's totally the abiding sin of America. He was also favoring the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which brings it back to the states. And I oppose Roe v. Wade precisely because it brings it back to the states. And I think this is an issue that should be confronted on a national level. And we need to change hearts and minds so that the consensus omnium in a democracy, for better and for worse, really does lead the day. And if we try end rounds, whether through the Supreme Court or executive options, we will have the consensus omnium turn against us eventually. And I want to do whatever it takes to lower the abortion rate. So I was questioning the consistency of saying it is the ultimate evil, but let's let states decide. I mean, because I agree with you. I think the abiding sin of America is slavery. And I'm not going to quantify which is more, abortion or slavery. But I think this is precisely where the government absolutely needed to step in the form of a civil war, or the war of northern aggression, as Texans like to call it. But I think it needed to step in and say, no, we're not leaving this up to the states. We're sorry.
This is wrong.
This is too important to us. Yeah, we can't countenance this. We're not, and all the amendments to the Constitution, we're not leaving that up to the states.
Yeah, but it's interesting though. I while being for the Union in the Civil War, I don't think, like, for example, Peter and I have talked about this in past podcasts, and we won't spend too much more on this. I think that suppose the South and the federal government were to outlaw abortion, and the states right now that are for abortion decide to leave the union, I don't think that would be something. I'm not pro Civil War. It's interesting though that
Right.
I do think the Civil War over slavery was appropriate. But if the states that are for abortion and want to continue that decide to leave the union, I'm completely thinking, okay, let's dissolve the union. So it's an interesting little turnabout that we have right now.
Yes, it is. And I'm not even going to touch that with the 10-foot pole. Let it sit there.
Okay, well, let's move on. Peter, are we good to move on your side?
Yeah.
Okay, Michael, tell us. I'm so sorry. Do you still have time to speak some about
Sure.
what are the biggest concerns that you have?
The two concerns, I mean, the ones that animate me these days,
Yeah.
right, is the hyper vitriolic rhetoric from the right, from the political far right, that I think is the greatest threat to democracy since the foundation of our country. That's one existential threat to me that somehow we need to come to terms with. And I'm all for that moderate party that's starting to be formed among disaffected Republicans who say we're more Reagan Republicans. We're not Trump Republicans. We don't believe in armed militias committing insurrections on the Capitol. We don't think that's the way to go. So that's one animating concern I have. And I live in Trump country up in the rural part of Eastern Washington, Northern Idaho, right? I'm right in the thick of it there. And, you know, we have parents driving their kids to school with F Biden stickers on their bumpers. And I think, oh, these poor kids being raised in such heinous households. I cannot believe how these kids are going to grow up. Of course, they're going to be hateful. It's just, really, it's unbelievable to me. I remember the first comment my kids made, because we lived I don't know, James, I don't think you ever came to our home in Pasadena, but we lived in a very mixed ethnic community. And one of the first things my son and daughter said when we moved to Spokane was like, oh my God, look at all these white people. There's so many white people. And, you know, so I worry about the jingoistic, atavistic, militaristic language being used to support things like owning AR-15s and AK-47s and F Bidens. I mean, the people are hanging these things from their front porch, and kids are driving by on their way to, you know, Catholic school, and this is what they get to read from their fellow Republicans. It just, oh my gosh! And for all the, so that's one on the right. The one on the left is I think where the right, the far right, is committing an insurrection against the institutions of democracy. The far left is committing an insurrection against our basic humanity, with a lot of what's being propagated among the LGBTQ platform, where we're starting to hear people saying that you can't use male and female anymore. There is no such thing as male and female. Those are old-fashioned binaries that no longer apply. And I think from both the far right and the far left, they are committing almost equally egregious insurrections. And those sorts of things animate me so much that I had to stop doing my podcast. And then I stopped doing my blogs for a while because I found myself so agitated by both sides of the political spectrum. I find them both so unbelievably dangerous that, and it gets back to my notion of what capitalism in its rawest form in this country does. It turns everything into a product, and everything is about our pleasure and what's best for us and what works for us. And I think it ends up being an incredibly, both sides commit an incredibly egregious offense against the kingdom of God. And it gets back to my Lord's Prayer ethic. If there aren't abortions in heaven, maybe there shouldn't be abortions here on earth. If there aren't guns in heaven, maybe we should limit the ownership of guns here on earth. If there isn't, whatever, you do the math, right? You pick up your favorite social issue. And so I think where we need to get back to first principles is to get rid of a lot of the terms that we just accept, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, and restart the conversation. And it may not be very practical, but we Americans our golden calf, whether you're on the right or the left, is productivity. What's the most productive and practical thing? But sometimes, the Nazis were very practical, very productive in the way that they decimated an entire people group, right? They were extremely efficient. But I don't think, obviously, that's the best rule to operate by at the end. I think we need to be thoughtful. We need to come back to the table, redefine the terms, use restraint, from my perspective, look at Scripture, revisit what it means to follow Christ, and then we can become witnesses for our secular brothers and sisters who have many reasons to hate the church, by the way, my brother among them, many reasons to despise what the church stands for, whether from the right or the left. So I think we're having largely inconsequential discussions, quite often well-meaning ones, but inconsequential in the end because we haven't stepped back and looked at first principles. We don't know what the first principles are anymore. And so we accept the terms handed to us. That's Heidegger's predetermined, interpreted reality.
Well, we don't have words. Words have us.
Right, indeed. And Emily Dickinson said as much. Some say that a word dies when it's said. I say it just comes. I just butchered her poem, but it comes to life that day. Words define us. We don't define them, right? Really, ultimately. So if you grew up in a household that regularly uses the N-word, you are going to objectify Black people. Through no immediate fault of your own, because they've been objectified for you. If you grew up in a home that objectifies women, then you're going to brag about grabbing their private parts because they're objects that you can do with as you will. If we objectify criminals, then we can justify putting them on an electric chair. If we objectify fetuses, we can justify having an abortion.
How can we get back to first principles, though? Can you give us some how can we? Yeah. I'd love to get to there.
Yeah, as corny as this is going to sound, and it's going to sound terribly corny, so all corny alerts, you can put them on your podcast right now, is to, I think it's, I have some impractical suggestions and some practical suggestions. My impractical suggestions are to get off as much media as possible. Social media, other media, with the exception, of course, the glaring exception of this podcast.
Thank you.
But every other form of media, get off it as quickly as possible and start to exercise Sabbath restraint. Go on. So we don't have internet at our home for this very reason, because we think both the right and the left are wackadoodles who've completely lost their minds. And we need to return to just thoughtful conversation. So get off of media, start having family dinners again. Make sure that your church, if you happen to go to church, spends as much time in the New Testament as the Old. And if you have to balance it out, spend more time in the New than the Old, because the Old Testament justifies all kinds of things that Jesus came to overturn. And they're quoting scripture, right? They're Bible-believing churches. They just happen to preach out of Daniel and Jeremiah too much. So return to a thoughtful conversation about first principles, like form groups and say, what are our first principles? The dignity of human life based on Imago Dei, loving your enemy. What does that look like? And then I think, James, this is where it makes you uncomfortable, and for every good reason. A lot of this sounds terribly impractical, like, oh, that sounds good, Bruner, whatever, pie in the sky, theologizing. But practically, what can we do? But here's where I think it makes a difference, is if we start having those conversations among, and I applaud your podcast for doing this very thing. we can start not yelling at each other, but talking to each other. We can start exercising some restraint. I fast on a regular basis, not because I'm a super spiritual guy, quite the opposite, but because it focuses me. It really focuses me. And I have adult ADD, as you might have been able to tell. So when I fast, I remind myself that every time I'm thinking of food, and it's going to sound again, here's second corny alert, I need to pray. So man, when I'm fasting, I'm a prayer warrior. It's ridiculous, right? Because I'm hungry and my family has the audacity to eat donuts in front of me and I'm fasting, and shame on them. But I try to become more thoughtful and more self-critical. So I think getting off social media, opening up our dinner tables again where we can sit as a family and talk together. And then the last thing I'll say is this, is if we can't get along as a family, how on earth do we expect to get along as a country?
Yeah.
And I think one of the hidden travesties of Western culture in particular, but every culture is affected by this, is the amount of abuse and rancor and terrible things that happen inside our homes.
Yeah.
And I think if we can start to change the family dynamic and we can start listening to each other, then we can start really listening to the pleading of a young African-American or Hispanic or white Native American girl who got pregnant at 13 because some older guy, and she doesn't know what, she can't imagine carrying a baby to term, and she doesn't want to kill any baby. She doesn't know what to do. So we listen to them. We can't listen to the fetuses because they can't speak. So we have to speak for them. We need to listen to the rivers and the trees and the lakes, and we're raping the earth in the name of progress. Oh my goodness, but we'd start having discussions. We start talking. Anyway.
Well, I want to say all of the things that you said, like the specifics about how to, that I 100% agree with. And I bet Peter will too. Would you forgive me a presumption perhaps?
Please.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you. I want to challenge you to try to find a way to find the most detestable pro-Trumper and become friends with that person, because it sounds like they really are surrounding you. Your community is people that, I don't know, maybe you already have.
I do. I have quite a few pro-Trump friends.
That's great. I think if you can have conversations with them about first principles, then I think that you'll find many ways that you agree with pro-Trump.
Oh, 100%, James. I mean, half the people I've hired to help me on my house come up with F Biden signs, and I think, oh Lord, and I mean, a guy walked into a Starbucks 2 weeks ago and he was open carry and he had a Glock, on his sidearm. And I thought, okay, should I absolutely freak out because he's about to shoot everybody? Or should I hope that someone else has an AR-15 or AK-47 that can gun him down in case he pulls his gun from his holster? And I didn't know, is this a bad guy or a good guy walking in? Is this a law-abiding, Trump-loving, truck-driving, whatever, I vote for Brandon? Is he going to come in and he just open carrying because he likes it and he needs to prove his manhood? Or is this guy about to shoot up the Starbucks?
Right.
So I'm surrounded by Trumpers, right? And I have to deal with them every day. Some of them are my friends.
Good.
And what I find about Trumpers, just like far left LGBTQ people, who I think are equally wacky, taken by themselves, people are okay. You can have conversations.
That's right.
Get them in a group, and we're in huge trouble on both the right and the left.
That's interesting. Yeah, the mob mentality.
Totally.
Okay. I want to give you, can we move on to your second? Do you mind?
Well, yes.
You do mind.
So the LGBTQ thing, is that the second one? Is that, and well, then there's the environment, of course, but let's just all agree that the world is going to hell environmentally, and we need to figure out ways to not help that happen. But for me, again, I have friends, of course. I mean, this sounds so corny to even say this, but whatever. I have friends who are in the LGBTQ community, and I really try not to, I try not to demonize anyone. I mean, sometimes I'm successful and sometimes I'm not, but I think the platform is a form of kind of a modern day eugenics movement. And I hesitate to say that. In fact, I took a blog down because I realized using the term eugenics is way too explosive, because that's what the Nazis were accused of doing, by trying to create the white Aryan race. But I do think that the LGBTQ movement needs to be very careful about how it proceeds, because it can come across to some of us like a modern eugenics movement where we're trying to redefine what a person actually is, and being told we're no longer male and female, telling teachers don't call your students in your third grade classroom boys and girls anymore, allowing boys to go into girls' bathrooms, girls go into boys' bathrooms depending on how they feel, doing sex reassignment surgeries. I mean, wow, you guys. So you move from sort of transsexual. Remember, back when we were young, James, we would talk about people, who were trans people, not in the term way it's used today, but like there was cross-dressing, and then there was transsexuals, and then it becomes transgender, where we're not even genders, and then Ray Kurzweil and his ilk with transhumanist, and so what I think happens is that we're on this trajectory. It's a continuum, and it all comes on both the right and the left, and this will sum up my problem that keeps me up at night, is our distorted ideas of freedom. I think we have so bastardized and distorted what freedom actually means in the biblical sense. We've done it on the right with our idolatrous relationship to guns. We've done it on the left with our idolatrous relationship to ourselves. And we are living out the judgment pronounced in Romans chapter 1, where Paul said, and so God saw what was going on and what was being done, and his punishment was not to intervene, it was to leave us alone. And so he left them to their devices. Now he happens to use men sleeping with men, women sleeping with women. Yes, okay, and I think that's a pertinent thing, but it affects all of us. And I think we have turned very distorted notions of freedom into an idol. And we no longer really know what we're talking about. And so that's what finally, the manifestation of distortion on the right comes in the form of guns. The manifestation of freedom on the left comes in the form of the LGBTQ movement. And I think we need to really take a step back and say, what do we mean by freedom? And who is truly free? And, I just saw Bob Dylan the other day with my daughter, because I told her, you have to see the living legend while he's still alive. And just the week before, we saw Paul McCartney. Ooh. So I'm introducing my daughter to the wonderful parts of culture. And there's a great line in one of Dylan's songs, my favorite one off of his newest album. Gosh, I'm just not remembering it right now. It'll come to me. About JF Kennedy's assassination. But there's a line in there, only dead men are free. We aren't free. I don't even believe in free will. And I tell that to the shock and horror of my students until I explain to them what I mean by that. Our wills aren't free. And if we think they are, and that somehow we can make decisions right or wrong, and it all depends on us, we've already left the pages of Scripture far behind. That's not a biblical principle to any degree. And we're kind of on our own. And then we're just manifesting Romans 1. We're doing what's right in our own eyes. We're doing, and so, yeah, I think to myself, oh my gosh, there's so many layers that we don't even discuss anymore that have such a profound effect on the very things we're talking about. But we're not even looking at these earlier principles. And so, yeah, I don't know. That's
100% agree on the idea about freedom. My idea of a perfectly free person is someone who's in a coma floating in a vacuum in some sort of tank where that's just their state.
Well, indeed. And I know you're partly kidding and partly being serious, James. And my idea of someone in perfect freedom is someone who's surrendered more and more of their will to Christ.
Right.
And they become freer. And the more we surrender that will to him, the more he returns that will to us. And the church, shame on the church Shame, shame, shame on the church for being among the worst offenders on the both right and left in terms of the bastardized view of freedom.
Yeah, it reminds me of when a reporter once asked Pope John Paul II, what do you do when you get to just choose what you'd like to do? And he says, I always do what I like to do.
Yes.
It's exactly, the more we say yes to God, the more free we are, like you said. However, we're giving up that freedom. But, we give up that freedom. I gave up 2.5 hours to talk to you, and you gave up 2.5 hours to speak to me. We gave up our freedom for these 2.5 hours. So I think, that our ill-conceived notion of freedom is destroying everything that we've built up to this point.
Totally. It's an ill-conceived notion of freedom. It's a bastardized, distorted view, and you can't have freedom without restraint. It's impossible. And the Bible tells us that from the very beginning, right? Freedom isn't the freedom to do whatever you want. That's prison. That's Romans 1. Freedom is operating within the constraints that God has laid down for us in the Ten Commandments, in the Sermon on the Mount. That's when we're truly free. You try to erase all those constraints, you don't have freedom, you have chaos. And we live in a chaotic culture, thanks to the far right and thanks to the far left. And frankly, thanks to all of us. We're complicit in so much of this. So I think I make for a terrible dinner guest because I'm constantly wanting to go back to first principles that we don't even have the capacity to hardly talk about.
Well, I think we agree on most of those things, though.
Yeah.
That's the whole point, is in order to have a functioning society, we agree to certainly properly basic beliefs. I think that's Plantinga, Alvin Plantinga from the old Notre Dame. So another Catholic guy.
Another good Catholic, yes.
You have to have those properly basic beliefs for something to work.
Totally.
And so if you and I sit down and we talk at a dinner party and we get to those properly basic beliefs, then I think we're going to actually come up with some good ideas for fixing things.
No doubt about it.
But if we sit around and run about the planet's burning, or I gotta, I don't like that socialism and, things like that. If, we talk about these little bookshelf sort of ideas that we pull off the shelf and we bring out the argument, then we're just going to get what we've got already.
Full on. Totally. Because we're already at fifth and sixth principles, and that's where we spend our time arguing. What's the point?
I think it's a really good point that in our modern day culture, let's just start really basic. Let's respect language enough so that we don't use it as a weapon. Let's try and use it to communicate as it's meant to be used. So I think that's a really good point. Thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think that has to happen, so that if you're talking with someone who disagrees with you in abortion, well, let's go back to first principles. Okay, how do you define a human being? And then you go from there. And if you take people back to first principles, it's quite shocking often to see these light bulbs going off in their heads, where they start to realize they've comported entire political positions around a fifth principle, not a first. They haven't thought about it. I 100. That was the whole point and purpose of my podcast and my blog on my website that you helped build. Let's get back to first principles, or what T.S. Eliot called the permanent things. Let's talk about those, and then let's build out from there. But let's not walk into a room marked fifth principles and get into an argument because our views of reality are so unbelievably different. We're not going to get anywhere.
Well, then we're also not really sure what we're arguing about. I think another problem that I know I experience is that I don't like speaking about these sort of things that should be spoken about. Like, I don't like speaking about things that might make someone uncomfortable. I don't like speaking about things that force me to think or force someone else to think and get into an uncomfortable position. But I think sometimes first principle ideas force that sort of confrontation.
And it's as old as the hills, right? It's Socrates said it. If you're going to get into debate, first agree on the terms.
Yep.
And he said if opposing sides could just agree on the terms, 90% of arguments would flitter away. They would just disappear. So if we can just agree on the terms, Oh my goodness, but look at what's happening in our political culture today. I mean, it's just embarrassing, and it's infuriating, and it's exhausting, and it's just like, oh man, that's so, yeah, it almost feels futile, but then I have to believe, that the kingdom of God is breaking in, and that there may be a dark age we're living through, but if we can find people like the two of you and find more people like that, and we can agree to engage in first principles and talk about that, I think we're okay. The light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness shall not put it out. So
that's great.
You guys are shining a light, and I'm grateful for you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for the kind words. Thank you for sitting down and talking. I know we've asked other people that disagree with us to talk with us, and you're the first one that said yes. So thank you very much. And I find that we don't, and I was expecting this really, that we don't disagree that much, really, right. Even though we vote very differently. Right. I'm wondering, I would love to, Peter and I have spoken about how I'd love to get different, we don't want to get into this now because we've already gone far too long, but I want to get your opinion about stuff like gun control and things like that. And because I want to hear a well thought out perspective. And I think you would have that great, well thought out perspective. And I think our audience would appreciate, like we could bring two different sides. So that's just one example. It's a roundabout way of saying, would you come back again someday and be our guest?
I would be happy. I would love to do it. You guys are very gracious. You're very thoughtful. You're just lovely conversation partners. And I would be honored to do it. Give me a few months to recover from this podcast.
Don't worry. Yeah, we're going to need to recover too.
So that we can do it. But I am grateful that you guys are doing this. I'm grateful that you'd want me back. I'm ashamed at my political compatriots that no one was agreeing to get together with such thoughtful people. But I mean, what is a democracy but people who disagree, who learn to live together?
That's right.
Right?
That's exactly it.
So I think more power to you guys, to what you're doing. And I would love to, I can't say I'd love to talk to you about gun control because it makes me ill, but the whole issue, because it's so fraught with so much stuff. Yeah. But I feel it is my duty to share with you as thoughtfully as I can my argument for why I think why I believe what I happen to believe. Yeah.
That and first principle. I think we'll start with the first principles and then we'll get somewhere, I think.
And the Lord's Prayer, right? The Lord's Prayer ethic. If we can't defend its existence in heaven, we shouldn't fight for its existence on earth.
Love it. All right. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and sign off. Pete, thank you for being our co-host today.
Thank you for joining us, Michael. Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to having you back. Thank you so much. God bless
you. As every good Californian would say, namaste.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. Please leave us a comment, give us a like and a subscribe, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pinedo Brothers Podcast, an artist podcast for Catholics. We hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please consider subscribing, and commenting below. That really helps. This episode was edited and recorded by me, JP. Makeup was done by no one, if you couldn't tell. The Pinedo Brothers are Catholic filmmaking brothers working to revitalize the world of Catholic art through film. For more information on us, check us out at pinedobrothers.com. Thanks again.